So what's your thinking on how digital media is actually impacting our well-being? Share that with us.
So I think at this point, if we can get my slides up there, I'll share a little bit from my research about some of these time trends here in how things have changed. And that's my book, iGen, about this topic. So, as I mentioned, I've been doing this research on generational differences for about 25 years. And I got used to seeing generational shifts that were big, but would take a decade or two to roll out. Then around 2011 or 2012, in these very large national data sets of teens and college students that I analyze, I started to notice changes that were bigger and more sudden. I'd really never seen anything like it. So, for example, more teens started to say that they felt left out. More started to say that they felt lonely. More started to say they felt like they couldn't do anything right, or that their life wasn't useful, or that they didn't enjoy life. And these are classic symptoms of depression. So these two were from the data sets that I usually work with. Then these trends started to show up in other data sets too, big national government screening surveys. So this is major depressive episodes. That's clinical level depression that really needs treatment in the last year. Among 12 to 17-year-olds was pretty much unchanged until 2011. And then by 2016, 60% more teens fit the criteria for having major depressive episode in the last year compared to just 5 years before. That's a pretty big shift in a very short period of time. For 18 to 24-year-olds, there was also a rise, but it was not as pronounced. The CDC recently released this data on emergency room visits for self-harm, things like cutting or taking too many pills. And they found a pretty pronounced increase for girls in particular. That's 15 to 19-year-olds. And then among 10 to 14-year-old girls, the rate of self-harm tripled in just a 6-year period. It's a study that just came out in pediatrics. Suicidal ideation, so thinking about suicide and suicide attempts for hospital admissions across the same time period, also a pronounced increase for teens. And then, as has already been mentioned, the suicide rate for teens doubled over this time period. And it's important to note that the suicide rate overall has been on the increase for adults across all ages, but for a longer time. It's a longer standing increase, more like since about 2000. But for teens, it had actually been going down until about 2007, and then it began to go up. So I think in looking at these graphs, I think pretty much everyone who sees them has this question: what happened? That was certainly the question that I had. And at first, I really had no idea what could possibly be causing this. It didn't seem to be economic factors, because as you notice, many of those trends really didn't get going until about 2011, when the US economy was improving. So it didn't seem to be the Great Recession. And so I really puzzled over this for a very long time. What happened around 2011 or 2012 that might be at the root of this? And then I realized, well, what happened in that year? This happened. Sure enough, we know from polls from the Pew Research Center, 2012 is the year when the percentage of Americans who owned a smartphone crossed 50%. So at 2011, 2012, that's when smartphones became common. And we started to see scenes like this. You're in a public place and everybody's looking at their phones. When just a few years before this, say in 2009, you didn't see scenes like this. Because what did people have back then? They had flip phones. You remember those? They just weren't that interesting. People weren't doing this. Because you had to press the same button, to get one letter on a text. Do you remember that? Or you could take a selfie, but you'd be like, yeah, is that me or is that my dog? Like, it just wasn't that good. And the technology wasn't there to, draw people in. So you can see the time sequence here. Here's one of the studies on teen depression. Here's the ownership of smartphones. Here's the amount of time that teens say they spend online. And then what does not line up is, say, the unemployment rate, one indicator of the health of the US economy, which is actually going down and getting better. It's not just digital media and smartphone use, though. It's also that use of digital media has risen to such a high level among teens and arguably among adults as well, that it has displaced the time that teens used to spend doing other things, like getting together with their friends face to face. So you saw that mentioned in the video. It's not just a perception, it's not just anecdote. The number of teens who get together with their friends face to face, there's the pattern. That's among 12th graders, 10th graders, and 8th graders. And that decline begins around 2000 with the internet and then really accelerates in the age of the smartphone. And it shows up across pretty much any question you can ask about teens getting together with each other face to face. They also don't sleep enough. Teens in this age group need about 9 hours of sleep, so less than 7 is a significant amount of sleep deprivation. CDC data on 9th to 12th graders, so there's a big increase in the percentage who aren't sleeping enough. And the survey on 8th, 10th, and 12th graders shows the same. This is also a trend that got going in the 90s, but then things actually improved during the 2000s. More awareness around the issue, perhaps. But then around 2011, just like everything else, sleep deprivation goes up, and in both surveys, it's at all-time highs. So you could say, well, teens are spending their time in a different way. Does that matter? Here's the connection to suicide risk factors like depression or suicidal ideation. Those who spend 3 hours a day or more on electronic devices are about 35% more likely than those who spend less time than that to have at least one risk factor for suicide. TV has a smaller risk. Then other things that don't involve a screen tend to be potential protective factors. Sports and exercise, those who do that a lot versus less, are less likely to have those risk factors, as well as those who get enough sleep. So things on a screen tend to be associated with a higher risk. Things that are not on a screen, potential protective factors. So it is difficult to prove for sure that the rise in digital media and the popularity of the smartphone is at the root of this, but it is very, very suspicious that teen depression increased right at the time that smartphones became common, and that we know from this research on time use connected to mental health issues that that pattern of time, sure enough, is associated with that. You could make the argument, well, maybe it's teens who are depressed and spend more time on screens, but there's longitudinal experimental studies suggesting at least some of the causation is clearly going from from screens to depression rather than the other way around. And it is a difficult case to make. You can't do random controlled experiments and assign people to be born at different times. It's literally impossible. So random controlled trials are out of the question. You have to rely on the data that you have. But I do think from the data that we have, it is at least a plausible explanation for at least some of the increase in mental health issues, given that the time sequence lines up and given that this pattern of time use is associated with these issues. As well, that my conclusion is that we have a generation that is physically safer, probably the safest generation in history, yet is more mentally vulnerable. It's an intriguing combination that suggests the ways in which we've had some success in protecting our children, and then the ways in which them spending their time in their bedroom might keep them physically safe, but may not be the best for their mental health. So let's talk about that idea of moderation. So Nir just mentioned this about some of these studies showing this interesting pattern in digital technology use and well-being. So this is from a couple of studies, and across the bottom there's hours per day on electronic devices or online. And we can look first at high levels of use, so 5 or more hours a day, and see how those individuals differ from those spending less than an hour a day. And this, by the way, this population of spending 5 or more hours a day depends on the study, but it's 10% or 20% of teens. It's not 1%. So this is not like the far end of psychopathology. This is a fairly good number of kids. So those who are spending 5 or more hours a day compared to 1 are about 50% more likely to not sleep enough. They're about 70% more likely to have at least one of those risk factors for suicide. and they're twice as likely to say that they're unhappy. But then you notice the other piece here is that the teens who aren't using digital media at all are not necessarily the most well-adjusted, that there's a little bit of a curve there. So that's partially probably who those teens are. There's probably some with special needs or are very disadvantaged. But I also think there's probably some in there whose parents took their phones away, so they're really mad, not very happy. But I think, what this really points toward is limited use, that up to 2 hours a day or so doesn't have these consequences. It's really overuse or an excessive amount of use. That doesn't necessarily mean it's really a huge outlier, because there are a fair number of teens who are spending 3 hours a day or more of their leisure time with screens. It's not a small percentage, but it does show that it's limited use where there's the best effects, and that it just kind of steadily builds. So overall, I think what this research and many other studies suggest, very similar to what the American Academy of Pediatrics says, that we should be limiting recreational screen time to 2 hours a day or less. And then what I think is the most important is the issues around sleep, because not getting enough sleep is a major risk factor for mental health issues as well as physical health issues. So too many teens have their phones in their bedroom, stay up late on them, wake up in the middle of the night and are on their phones. Almost every teen I talked to for the book said that their phone was the last thing that they saw before they went to sleep at night. And this is not a good formula for mental health, because the phones are psychologically stimulating. They're also physiologically stimulating, because the blue light shines into your eyes, keeps your brain from producing the melatonin, the sleep hormone that you need to get a good night's sleep. So this is not just for teens. This is good advice for everybody, to make sure that that phone is as far away from your bedroom as you can get it. And if you're wondering, well, wait, that's my alarm clock, I have some quick advice for you. Buy an alarm clock.
Absolutely.
In the end, I'm actually somewhat hopeful about this, because when we think about the causes of depression, unhappiness, mental health issues, it's a long list of things that cause those issues, starting with genetic predisposition, trauma, poverty, abuse, discrimination. Those are all things that are really difficult to solve, especially as individuals. We can't change the genes we were born with. We can't change the negative things that happened to us in the past. We're not going to solve poverty overnight, as much as we might like to. But we can control how we spend our leisure time. And we can get this message across to the young people that we care about. That, sure, use your phone for the things that it's good for. Harness that technology. But get together with your friends face to face. Have that emotional connection. That's what those teens talked about in the video. And they know that. They're not oblivious to this. Those teens in the video are, in my experience, typical, that they know that that's better. And to get enough sleep and go for a run or a swim. Be present in the moment. Enjoy the sunset. Go for a hike in the mountains if you're lucky enough to live here in Colorado. Read a book. All of these things that we know from decades of research are key for mental health and happiness as human beings. Because smartphones are great, This is great technology. We're not going to put the genie back in the bottle. They can do so many wonderful things for us, but they need to be a tool that we use and not a tool that uses us. And that's really the key. I got this from a high school teacher. It says, "Does your cell have bars? Are you sure you're not its prisoner?"
How do we guard against this incredible temptation?
So I have 3 kids. The oldest is almost 12, and I have a 9-year-old and a 6-year-old. So obviously I've thought about this a lot. At one time, they had individual Kindle Fires, and then I realized that was really upping their screen time, that they had their own device. So one of the graphs I made for the book that showed those correlations with screen time and non-screen time, after I made the graph, I got it from my desk chair, took the Kindle Fires and shoved them in the back of a desk drawer. True story. And I thought at first that they'd flip out, and they didn't. They actually barely noticed. It was kind of surprising. So they just don't spend quite as much time on screens. They do still, spend some time. My oldest has some dedicated time at night that she uses to watch videos, but it's half an hour. And we have had that discussion. And she's actually seen my talk 4 times, which helps too. But we've had that discussion of, yeah, you know, a little bit of this is fine and fun, but we're going to put it away. And my younger 2 can barely even remember a time before, you know, we had these limits. So for them, it's easy. It's just like, okay, it's time to go play outside, and they'll go do it. And it's really amazing what kids can come up with to amuse themselves at these ages when you just say, okay, we're done and we're not going to use that anymore. So one day, my oldest set up an obstacle course in the backyard for her younger sisters and whispered to me, she said, it's an obstacle course, but I'm going to tell them it's superhero training. So I'm like, you're going to go into advertising, honey. Good job. So, and they come up with creative things to spend their time. So it works.